Beneath the headlines, behind the timelines, there is a story no one wants you to find. Welcome to some unapproved thinking, where forgotten truths, buried patterns, and invisible systems rise to the surface. You weren't crazy. You were just early. Let's begin.
There's a mercury-backed antique mirror in your grandmother's attic that hasn't been unwrapped in 30 years. Dust particles float through a shaft of light. Your hand reaches for something that's been wrapped in cloth for decades. The moment you unwrap it, you feel it. That peculiar heaviness that isn't about weight, it's about presence. And the moment you look into it, something inside your chest tightens in a way you can't explain. Most people dismiss this feeling. They move on. They don't ask why cultures across Europe, Asia, and the Americas all developed the exact same taboo about old mirrors at exactly the same time. They don't ask why the Aztecs carved obsidian mirrors for their god Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, who could show warriors their death before battle. They don't ask why Chinese bagua mirrors have hung over doorways for 3,000 years, or why John Dee, advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, spent years gazing into a dark mirror trying to communicate with angels. They don't ask why Mercury was so carefully guarded, why emperors hoarded it, why the process of backing mirrors with Mercury was treated like a sacred ritual that demanded payment in blood and silence. This is some unapproved thinking.
Thank you to our sponsor, the Dark Horse Entrepreneur Podcast. Unlock your potential with the Dark Horse Entrepreneur AI Escape Plan, the podcast empowering hardworking parents to break free from the 9-to-5 grind through AI-powered side hustles. Check them out at darkhorse-entrepreneur.com. Now back to the show.
Here's what they're not telling you. Mercury isn't just a heavy metal. It's a liquid that exists between states, not quite solid and yet not quite vapor. For centuries, alchemists believed Mercury was the physical manifestation of the soul itself, the philosopher's stone, the bridge between worlds. When you combine Mercury with silver, and silver conducts energy in ways modern science still doesn't fully explain, you create a reflective surface that does something unprecedented. It doesn't just reflect light. According to texts that have been deliberately removed from mainstream historical records, mercury-backed mirrors create a specific frequency resonance, a standing wave, a doorway. The practice of using mirrors to see beyond the present moment even has a name that historians acknowledge openly: catoptromancy, mirror scrying. It's in the records. What's not in the records is why it worked. The first documented cases date back to medieval Europe, though the phenomenon is far older. In the 1400s, Venetian glassmakers on the island of Murano developed a technique for applying mercury tin amalgam to glass that made their mirrors the most prized objects in the world. The Council of Ten, Venice's ruling body, was so paranoid about this secret that they issued standing orders. Any glassmaker who fled Venice to share the technique with a foreign power would be hunted down and assassinated. Their families would be threatened, their names destroyed. This wasn't commerce. This was state-level suppression of a technology. One guildmaster of this era left behind fragmented writings, obsessive entries about seeing things in the mirror that weren't there when he looked away. "The glass remembers," he wrote. "It holds what passes through it." The mirrors in his studio were found shattered intentionally, methodically. Every reflective surface completely destroyed. His apprentices reported that in the days before his death, he had covered every mirror in the workshop with cloth. They said he whispered to them while they were still covered, as if something on the other side was listening. When Louis XIV wanted this technology for Versailles, he had Venetian mirror makers smuggled out of Murano in secret. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, 17 arches of mercury-backed glass, was built on stolen knowledge that men had died to protect. Stolen and displayed as power. You need to understand the science here to understand why the establishment buried this. Mercury has an unusual atomic structure, 80 protons. It's one of the few metals that's liquid at room temperature. This means its electrons are in a constant state of flux, more responsive to electromagnetic fields than any other common metal. When light hits a mercury-backed mirror, the reflection doesn't behave like conventional reflection. It lags. Microscopically, yes, but measurably, there's a delay, a hesitation, as if the light is being processed rather than simply bounced. Researchers in the 1920s discovered this, Soviet physicists specifically. They were studying Mercury's properties for weapons applications and found something they didn't expect. The delay increased when a human subject was observing. Yeah, when consciousness was present, the lag time grew longer. The paper was published, then poof, it vanished. Not metaphorically. The journal issue was recalled. Copies were destroyed. Scientists who discussed it publicly were discredited or reassigned. This isn't unique to mirrors. Researchers studying the Ganzfeld effect, a perceptual phenomenon where prolonged mirror gazing triggers anomalous visual experiences, have encountered the same institutional resistance. The strange face illusion, documented in peer-reviewed literature, shows that staring into a mirror under low light causes most subjects to see faces that aren't their own. These are real, documented perceptual phenomena. The question is whether they're glitches in the matrix or whether they're the edges of something the science hasn't caught up to yet. The real question you should be asking is, why? Why would governments care about mirrors? Why would the Vatican's archives contain an entire section dedicated to speculum prohibitus, forbidden mirrors? Many have seen the cataloging system, and the restriction notices mirrors aren't weapons. Mirrors aren't threats, right? Unless there's something else entirely. Here's what happened in the 1600s that nobody talks about. A nun named Sister Margarita, isolated in a convent in northern Italy, reported that she could see her own death in an antique mirror. Not metaphorically, literally. She described in clinical detail a specific accident, a fall downstairs, a fracture at the third vertebra, the exact position of her body as it came to rest. She wrote a full account and sealed it away. Then, 60 years later, in 1687, she died, exactly as described. Same stairs, same injury, same final resting position, but the convent kept the mirror. They didn't destroy it. Nope, they just locked it away. The documentation of this event exists in the Library of Congress. You can request it. What you'll find is heavily redacted, but the core narrative remains. Margarita saw her future in mercury-backed glass, and her future saw her back. This is where the narrative usually fractures into fantasy and folklore. But you're not here for fantasy. You're here because you've noticed that official narratives have holes. You've learned that governments and institutions systematically hide technologies and knowledge that might destabilize control, and you sense, correctly, that this is another instance of that pattern. The reflection principle isn't mysticism. It's physics that wasn't supposed to exist yet. Mercury-backed mirrors create what quantum physicists now reluctantly acknowledge as a coherence field. A localized area where quantum superposition doesn't collapse cleanly, where multiple states remain simultaneously possible longer than they should, where essentially you can observe things that haven't happened yet because the boundary between observer and observed breaks down. NASA started studying this in the 1990s, not publicly, but their contractors, the ones with unblinking federal funding and no congressional oversight, they investigated Mercury's quantum properties extensively. Why? Because if you can create a coherence field large enough, you can theoretically observe probability clouds. You can see the branching paths of potential futures. The research was quietly shelved. Too destabilizing. Too easy to abuse. Imagine a technology where world leaders could literally see the consequences of their decisions before making them. Imagine them choosing poorly anyway. Imagine what that tells you about their actual intentions. Here's what also happened around this time. In 1835, a German chemist named Justus von Liebig invented a new silvering process, replacing mercury tin amalgam with silver nitrate. Within decades, mercury-backed mirrors vanished from production entirely. The official story is that Liebig's process was simply better, safer, more efficient. But consider the timing. Consider that this transition happened precisely as the research into Mercury's anomalous properties was becoming too interesting to ignore. The technology wasn't lost to progress, it was retired. There's a difference. The taboo about antique mirrors isn't superstition. It's suppressed information leaking out as folklore. It's ancestral memory encoded in warnings. Your grandmother didn't tell you not to look in old mirrors because she was superstitious. She told you because she knew. Somewhere in her family line, someone had an experience they couldn't explain but also couldn't ignore. The warning got passed down. The mechanism got forgotten. So just the fear remained, but here's where it gets darker. Here's the part that should make you understand why this was buried so completely. In 1974, a research team in East Germany conducted an experiment. They used a mercury-backed mirror made in 1823, old enough to have what they called temporal saturation. A researcher named Klaus Henner looked into it for 30 seconds while his vital signs were monitored. His heart rate dropped below 40 BPM. His brainwave patterns showed simultaneous alpha and delta waves, states that shouldn't coexist. And when he described what he saw, he spoke about it in a way that haunted every person in the room. He said he saw himself in the mirror, but the reflection was older, much older. It was showing him his death, not as prediction, as memory, as something that had already happened, that was always going to happen, that was happening simultaneously in a parallel moment of time that mercury-backed glass made temporarily accessible. They did the experiment again. Different researchers. Same mirror, same results. By the third trial, they stopped. The last researcher who looked into the mirror developed a stress-induced psychosis that never fully resolved. He spent the remainder of his life believing he was already dead, that he died in that moment, and that everything afterward was a kind of echo. He was institutionalized. The mirror was destroyed. The research was classified. And the technology of mercury-backed glass manufacture was so thoroughly suppressed that it became impossible to find anywhere in the world. The process was lost, deliberately lost, by design. This is the floor you weren't expecting. This is where you realize the danger wasn't the mirror. The danger was what the mirror proved. That time isn't linear. That observation creates more than just collapse of superposition. It creates access. That consciousness doesn't just observe reality, it negotiates with it. And once you know that, once you truly know it, you can't unknow it. The power structures that hold civilization in place depend on you believing that the future hasn't happened yet. They depend on you feeling helpless, bounded by time, unable to see what's coming. Mercury-backed mirrors broke that illusion. They proved that you could see. That's why they were destroyed. That's why the knowledge was buried. Not because they were portals to demons or magical gateways. Nope, because they were windows to the one thing power fears most: clarity. The taboo persists because the instinct to protect the knowledge persists. Deep in your nervous system, you feel it when you encounter an old mirror, that tightness in your chest. That's not superstition. That's ancestral recognition. That's your body remembering what your mind was told to forget. That's the last echo of something humans once knew and were forced to unknow. You can't find mercury-backed mirrors anymore. They don't exist in private collections. Museums that once held them can't account for them. The manufacturing process has been lost to institutional darkness. But now you know why. And in knowing, you have become complicit in the silence. Because telling others what this means, telling them what it implies about reality itself, about the nature of time and observation and will, well, that marks you. That makes you dangerous to people who profit from your helplessness. So the real question isn't whether you should look in an antique mirror. The real question is, if you found one, and if you did look, and if you saw what Sister Margarita and Klaus Henner saw, would you want to unsee it? Would you? Would you want your future handed to you, stripped of its uncertainty and stripped of its possibility? Would you want to live knowing that what's coming has already happened, is already decided, and is already watching you back through the glass? That's why the mirrors were really destroyed. Not to protect you from them, to protect you from the choice. This has been Some Unapproved Thinking. Tracy, out.
If this story didn't sit right with you, good. You're not here to be comforted. You're here to see what others overlook. Thanks for exploring Some Unapproved Thinking. Learn more at someunapprovedthinking.com. New episodes drop weekly. Subscribe, share, and keep questioning, because the pattern's still playing out, and next time, we're going deeper.